self-organized, and if she wants to do something else, and she's always putting stuff in what I regard as her work. So then I just sort of dump it. We always go to wars.
Forget it. Whereas DC, I think they did a great job in so people could actually get around. It's smart.
Yeah, well, he and Joan. Well, something like that. They were doing fine. He has some thyroid. That this thing, the donkey on it, and I had my chewed by Dave Oldham. Everyone was playing very proud. And they have some but I did, they did with my site, they did it to Wausau, and they had a celebration in Wausau, and the people who helped in this peace campaign 40 years ago. There was a guy who was 94 there who was talking about it. So Joan's recovered. Sure, I see her in shape. I'm sure. A little bit shaky, but I mean, she was there sadly and
There, and you'll see those two angles together too. On which side? You want to be on the far side. Sorry, I'm like, no, shouldn't Whenever you're ready, Bill.
Good morning, and welcome all to the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Bill Hoagland, a Senior Vice President here at BPC, and I have the pleasure of working with our economic and health team on issues from the federal budget to Medicare to Medicaid, retirement security, all the way up to and higher, including higher education, which is the focus of our discussion today. Briefly, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with BPC, we were established a little bit more than about 10 years ago by 4 former majority leaders of the United States Senate, Senator Bob, on the Republican side, Senator Bob Dole, and the late Senator Howard Baker, and on the Democratic side, Senator George Mitchell and Senator Tom Daschle. These were leaders who I had the pleasure of working with when I was in the Senate for a long time. They were clearly partisan when they needed to be, but they were also willing to work across the aisle on the issues when they thought for the good of the country. So we carry forward with that idea here of bipartisanship on the issues challenging and facing the Congress and the country today, and clearly higher education is one of those issues. Under the guidance of Kenny Megan back here, Associate Director of our Economic Project, we created a task force a little bit over a year ago co-chaired by 2 former chairmen of the House Education and Workforce Committee, and interestingly, chairman and ranking member at one time or the other because of the switch when the Democrats went to Republican control. So we had the chairman and ranking member on the Democratic side, Congressman George Miller, and on the Republican side, Congressman Howard Buck McEwen are the co-chairs of that task force going forward. The task force with representatives from both public and private universities and colleges, state and local governments, and business leaders. They've been focusing on affordability and accountability of higher education. We expect the task force, we hope, will reach consensus on a series of recommendations in the next few months that maybe could help inform the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, something that hasn't happened for over a decade. Now to this morning. Thank you to our distinguished panelists and moderators for being here, and a special thanks to Strata Education Network for their support on our higher education work here. Today we are honored to have Diane Jones, Deputy Principal Undersecretary at U.S. Department of Education, who leads the department's higher education policy work. Secretary Jones brings with her a wealth of experience to this position, in addition to holding leadership roles at Princeton University, Career Education Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the White House on Science and Technology Policy, Secretary Jones previously served as Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education during the George W. Bush administration. And prior to her current position, she served as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor and as a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, where I got to know her. Interesting to me, Diane's degrees are in cellular and molecular biology, and at one point in her career, I find interesting that she owned a gourmet food store and an alternative health and wellness center. That's interesting background for that position. Secretary Jones will be joined this morning today on a discussion with Michael Stratford of Political to discuss the Department of Education priorities in the new Congress, with a particular focus on the issues related to school closures and accountability. Michael's most recently covered federal higher education and policy and student loans at Inside Higher Ed. He had previous bylines at the Associate Press, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine. And only appropriate, Michael, he was a managing editor of the Cornell Daily Sun at Cornell University, where he graduated. So without further ado, Michael, Secretary Jones, please have at it.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Diane for taking the time to chat with us. I'm excited I've been to a lot of these events, but this is my first official fireside chat, so I'm very excited about that. So we're here to talk a little bit about school closures, and then I hope we also might have a few minutes to chat about some of the other higher education issues of the day. I guess starting on school closures, we should start by pointing out that the vast majority of the 6,000 odd schools are doing fine. Their college closures are exceedingly rare, but they seem to be on an upward trajectory. They're increasing. We've seen some of the high-profile closures in recent years. I was just trying to make a quick list last night. Corinthian College's ITT Tech, Charlotte School of Law, schools owned by Education Corporation of America, some of the art institutes, Argosy University owned by Dream Center. Those are some for-profits, but the closure issue is not confined to the for-profit sector. We've seen most recently, for instance, Mount Ida College in Massachusetts close its doors. We know that college closures are particularly disruptive for students whose education is upended, and they can also be costly for taxpayers who have to, in some cases, bear the burden of forgiving the loans that students took out to go to those schools because they have a right under federal law to discharge their loans. So the Department of Education, this administration recently completed a negotiated rulemaking committee. You achieved consensus on a wide range of higher education issues, including some that specifically touch on closed school discharges. So I'm wondering if you can start maybe by talking us through what you reached consensus on with respect to closed school discharges and why you agreed to those provisions.
Sure. So first of all, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for your interest in this topic. It's obviously a topic that we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about. In some instances, there are school closures that are orderly closures where the school has made a very responsible decision that it needs to teach out the campus. And we have seen many instances, and these don't get reported on, but we have seen many instances where a school has engaged in an orderly teach out. It's a very costly and difficult undertaking. But I want to make it clear that we do have a number of schools that close, and they do so in an orderly fashion. So the students either can complete their program or move to a new school. So not every closure is bad. Enrollments are down across the country. These things ebb and flow. So when a school closes in an orderly fashion, usually everybody wins. When it is not an orderly closeout or not an orderly closure, it is, as you said, disruptive, expensive, unfair, stressful. So we've done a couple of things in rulemaking to try to move more closures in the direction of an orderly closure. So, for example, one of the things that we've learned through these processes is that while some institutions and some accreditors require teach-out plans all the time or very early on, other accreditors have not required teach-out plans early enough, or the teach-out plans have not been detailed enough. So one of the things that was in our rulemaking are triggers. So there are now financial triggers or other triggers that require an institution to file a teach-out plan with the accreditor. And furthermore, we've built more detail into the teach-out plan so that an institution has to list its programs, it has to provide information about the programs. Is it day program? Is it a night program? Is it a part-time program, a full-time program? And we will ask them, or the accreditor will ask them, to identify what other institutions in the area, or if it's an online institution online, could potentially take those students. So we want them to do the hard work that now states are stuck with doing, which is trying to find potential partners. We also learned through this that some accreditors will not allow a school to even talk about a teach-out agreement until they've announced the closure. We think it's too late. So we've built in provisions where an accreditor can require teach-out agreements. Of course, they won't be executed unless the school closes, but a school can be required to enter into teach-out agreements. So we've done things like that to try to push toward an orderly closure. We've also made some changes to the way a school could wind down. And so under the new regulations, if Title 4.8 is removed or accreditation is removed, there is an off-ramp now that if the school's academic quality is fine, the integrity of the institution is still fine, Title 4 can continue for up to another 120 days to get the teach-out plan implemented and to get students to the teach-out partner. Again, if an accreditor finds a problem with academic quality or academic integrity, of course they can do an immediate closure and not enact the 120-day off-ramp. But we think that off-ramp, frankly, we think accreditors will be a little more aggressive if they know that there's an off-ramp. I think everybody is fearful of precipitous closures. So we think that these provisions will allow everybody to be a little more aggressive and to shoot up the signal a little bit earlier. Michael is here. He was a negotiator, so I want to acknowledge that we have, and so is Ned. So we really appreciate the hard work that the negotiators did. It was a tough but really rewarding effort, so thank you.
And for maybe people who aren't initiated to the negotiated rulemaking process, what happens now? What's the timeline sort of going forward?
So we did an unusual thing because we had so many issues and we wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to get to consensus. We divided the issues into 3 buckets, and we will produce NPRMs, one for each bucket. Because we got consensus, there could be some movement of issues from one bucket to the next for the purposes of making sure that things are packaged that kind of go together. And we will produce 3 NPRMs. They will have a public comment period. We will review public comments, and then we'll go to a final reg. Because we got consensus, I think it would take a significant recognition on our part that either something in the reg is somehow not legal, or everybody around the table forgot something. But by and large, what's in the consensus reg will be what's in the reg.
And is the goal for these 3 NPRMs that all-important November 1st regulatory cliff? Is that the goal for these, or?
It's the goal.
Okay.
It's the goal, but we recognize that. I mean, look, it can be a lot of work, so I don't want to make false promises. So it is our goal. But as you saw with our regs last year, we think getting it right is better than getting it quick. And so we're committed to is getting it right. Now, probably getting it right is easier when you have consensus. So, but you know, if we get lots and lots of comments, we do have to and want to look at them. So I can't commit because I don't know how many comments we'll get, but it's the goal. Yeah.
I mentioned at the top the closed school discharge. You, I think, maybe made some tweaks to closed school discharge in this rulemaking, but in a separate rulemaking, you proposed some restrictions on when a student at a closed school can obtain a discharge, namely that when a teach-out is offered to the student, he or she wouldn't be eligible to get the closed school discharge. I think this administration has also been critical of the automatic, the 3-year automatic closed school discharge that the Obama administration implemented, and that you are now implementing, maybe reluctantly.
Not reluctantly.
Or you opposed it on policy grounds.
But we are implementing the reg as it's written.
Right. But can you talk about what your vision is for closed school discharge? Where do you see that ending up, and what is the balance that you're trying to strike?
So sure. So I think, so I can't speak in great detail about the borrower defense regulation because we're still in the process of going to a final rule. But I think what you're talking about is when we published the NPRM, what we were trying to do is incentivize orderly teach-outs. And so we included a provision that said, if a teach-out is provided and approved by the accreditor, then the student would not be eligible for closed school loan discharge. We got a tremendous amount of feedback from the public and realized that while the intent was to try to force orderly teach-outs, what we were doing is we heard from the public that that eliminates the student's choice that the student should have. And frankly, we heard from accreditors that they were nervous about approving teach-out agreements if it locked students in. And that was not our intent. So I cannot tell you what's in a final reg, but I will tell you that we read those public comments. We agreed with the public. And so you will see the final reg has a very different proposal than what was in our NPRM. So again, this is the process working. We had one intent. We learned from the public. There were unintended consequences, and so we will adjust. You will not see in the final reg the same policy that you saw in the NPRM regarding teach-outs. I think the other thing that may happen in the borrower defense reg that would be helpful to prevent certain future closures is, and it wasn't really our doing, right? So there are changes in accounting standards. The treatment of lease liabilities has changed because of changes in accounting standards. So whereas there may have been advantages to institutions who took very long leases on their building or space, which makes it very difficult to close a school, because if you close a school and you have a 20-year lease liability, that's a problem. We think that's why we saw some receiverships. There are now some disincentives to very long lease liabilities as a result of changes in accounting standards, and those two are addressed in the borrower defense reg. So it could be that the accounting standards are actually one of the most beneficial changes in terms of the cost of a teach-out is lower if you don't have a 20 or 30-year lease.
Okay.
Which is not to say that a school couldn't make the choice to have a long lease, but there are now financial disincentives to doing that.
And so is the next thing we should expect from the department on that is it true that you're doing a new NPRM or a final rule, or what's the next step on that?
Yeah, so we hit the pause button because we had published the NPRM, then there was a legal ruling, and so we had to hit pause to go back and review and decide do we need to do another NPRM? Do we need to do a final rule? And so I think our attorneys looked at that carefully, and we are continuing to move forward. It is likely at this point that we will move to a final rule, because in looking at potentially doing a new NPRM, it looked the same as the old NPRM. And so I think it is fairly likely that we will move to a final rule. But again, the final rule can only include items that were included in the NPRM. So, but that is still under review, so I will not make a commitment. I will just say that that appears to be where we are headed right now.
Okay. One thing that I've noticed from covering a few of these collapses, especially of the big schools, is it seems like the department was aware of some of the challenges, accreditors were aware of some of the challenges at these schools, state regulators may have been aware, maybe even the school went into court and said that we're in trouble. If you look at some of the local coverage of these events, they, to a school, interview students who said, I had no idea I was taking out loans to go to this school, and it was in such severe financial distress. Is the department doing anything, or do you want to do anything on notice to students? How should, it seems like an fair thing that a lot of people know that a school is potentially in trouble, but students are the last to know.
So that was the other thing that we took in the most recent negotiated rulemaking is we looked at the disclosures that were required, and we looked at triggers so that we are sure students get information, earlier, as a school faces different challenges, there are regulations that will go into effect as a result of this rulemaking that identify when a student has to be notified, how they have to be notified. There are still some closures that nobody predicts, right? It happens every once in a while that there's one that nobody predicted, and we have to be prepared. But for those where you see declining financials or you see other challenges, the regs will have clarity around notification of students.
One other thing on the closed school discharges, on the issue of closed schools, is letter of credit.
Yes.
The department has the power to require a school that's receiving federal student aid to post a letter of credit in the department's favor to protect against potential taxpayer liabilities down the line if it collapses. I know in 2016, I pried loose from the department through a Freedom of Information Act request a list of the colleges that have posted a letter of credit. And I think later they went on and put that on their website for 2016. Since this administration, we haven't seen a list posted. Is there an objection or reason to? This is a leading question, but shouldn't the public be able to see which colleges have posted a letter of credit and which haven't?
I actually wasn't aware that it wasn't on the website. This is not a conversation I've been involved in, so I have to go back and look. I don't know, maybe there's some legal reason why we can't. So I can't give you an answer because it's not a conversation I've had.
Okay.
I wasn't involved in a decision, so I'll look into it and get back to you. I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Do you think you're approaching letters of credit differently than the department has in the past now?
Wow. I don't think we're approaching them differently because the regulations are very clear about when letters of credit are required. I think, one of the things that maybe is different is there's one example where we actually cashed the letter of credit. It was coming close to expiring, and so instead of letting it expire, we cashed it, so we were sitting on the money. I think that was an unusual action to take, and maybe unprecedented. I don't know. I haven't looked at the history, but
That was ECA or Dream?
Dream Center. So I think that was unusual. So people will say the letter of credit expired. Well, no, it actually didn't expire. I mean, it did expire, but we cashed it. So we don't have a letter of credit because we were holding cash. So I think that is a unique situation that maybe is not clear to the public. Letters of credit, I have to tell you that letters of credit are tricky. You need the letter of credit because you need to have the protection. You'll never have a big enough letter of credit to offer full protection because it's not just the students who are eligible for a closed school loan discharge, but liabilities, could include other students through borrower defense. So on one hand, you probably can never hold enough to cover all of the liabilities, and on the other, if the letter of credit is too large, you're forcing a precipitous closure. And so it's tricky. Right. And so I think that each one of them is a unique situation where you look at the risk, you look at the potential liabilities, and you have to make a judgment call. I think one of the challenges, and by the way, the borrower defense rules in 2016 changed some things about letter of credit, which we are now implementing because the rule is in effect. So there are some differences there just because of the changes in the regs. But here's the challenge with letter of credit. I mean, so largely letters of credit are required when an institution fails their financial responsibility test, the composite score. And we get that information 2 years late, right? So, ECA, for example, had to post a letter of credit in 2017 based on the 2015 financials. The 2016 financials were such that we were not allowed to hold a letter of credit. And then the 2017 financials showed that we actually did need to hold a letter of credit. And so in 2018, when those financials were reviewed, we requested another letter of credit, and then we know what happened. So we're always going to be in this place where I think some people think that we can look into our magic ball and on any given moment see what the financials are at an institution at any moment in time. It doesn't work that way. So by the time we get their financials, their audited financials, and we review them for composite score, it's outdated. So what do? Well, in the case of ECA, we could not hold a letter of credit when they passed their composite scores, but we did have them on cash management. We did have them on heightened review. We were requiring them to submit rosters. So we do have tools that we can use to more carefully monitor an institution, but the regulations prevent us from holding letters of credit if an institution passes the financial responsibility test. So,
right.
So you're always looking in the rear view mirror, and oftentimes when things happen at an institution, they happen quickly, and
right.
You're not going to see that by looking 2 years or a year behind.
Right. I think there's no doubt from people across a wide spectrum of viewpoints on this that these are difficult and complicated things to manage. I want to shift gears a little. Mm-hmm. I know the department is planning to use its experimental sites authority to plan some new pilot programs. Can you talk a little bit about what's in the works?
Sure. So, we're still in the thinking process, and so certainly if people have thoughts, you should share them with us. We have a couple of experimental sites that we're looking at, but I think one that is most exciting. Through the task force on expansion of apprenticeship, what we learned is that the relationship between institutions and employers is something that everybody values, but they can be difficult to promote. Oftentimes, companies feel like they only get a call when they're being asked for money. And oftentimes, if you want to create an apprenticeship, that there's more than 10 hours worth of work involved a week. So one of the things we're looking at with our federal work-study program is potentially launching an experiment that would lift some of the caps that an institution now has on how it can spend its federal work-study dollars, so that some of those dollars could be used to support a student in the work-based learning component of an apprenticeship. The benefit of that is, perhaps if there's some support there, employers will be more willing to pay the academic costs of the didactic instruction. But also, when a student is in an apprenticeship and they're working 20 or 30 hours a week, they run the risk of losing their eligibility for Pell Grants because of the needs analysis. But federal work-study dollars are not included in the calculation of need. And so if we can use some of those federal work-study dollars to support students in the work-based portion of an apprenticeship, they would not lose their Pell eligibility automatically, right? Because those dollars wouldn't count. We think it could help build partnerships between institutions and employers. What a novel idea that the institution can now call an employer and say, hey, if you work with us, we might be able to help support some of the wages if you engage with us, and we can work with you on the curriculum. So we think that can be helpful. And then also there are some funds available for job development that very few institutions are actually using, and we think it could be because of the cap. And so one of the things we're thinking about is, should we lift the cap on the job development funds or provide additional funds so that, for an example, an institution could maybe, hire a person whose job it is to do that job development. If you're leaving it up to faculty and department chairs, it can be rather disjointed. So we're also looking at that, should we provide more support for the job development piece, at least initially, to help schools and businesses work together. So that's what we're looking at, details to be determined, but that's what we're thinking. And then, there's a lot of interest in income share agreements. I think that we've heard from many, many different sectors, wouldn't it be great if the federal government could play a role in income share agreements? We're not quite sure what that role would be or what it would look like, but we're certainly interested in engaging in the conversation. We think that there are some students who would benefit from an income share agreement, in particular because while income-driven repayment plans offer certain benefits for students, we're just seeing too many students in negative amortization, and interest capitalizes, and they find themselves in a hole. An income share agreement might have the same length of repayment, probably would have a lower percentage of discretionary income, but could have an equal percentage of discretionary income, but there will not be interest capitalization. And so we think that that would have tremendous benefits for students. So if you have thoughts on the federal role, we'd love to hear them. We're definitely interested in having that conversation. We just don't know exactly what that would look like, and so we're trying to figure that out.
When you first mentioned that a few weeks ago, I was a little confused because I thought ISAs were sort of being pitched as a private financing
So there
instrument.
are.
But in this case, the federal student loan would be sort of the initial capital. Is that?
Well, so for example, and certainly the private sector is doing its thing, and we wouldn't want to displace it. But one of the things that we hear is that there's a challenge because oftentimes income share agreements are not available until a student declares a major, the junior or senior year, but that student may need an income share agreement in the freshman year. And so is that a place where the federal government could play a role? Or is it just that we need regulations that would allow an income share agreement to essentially, package loan liabilities? So if the student actually takes a federal loan in their freshman year, could it be consolidated with an income share agreement so that the student is making one payment instead of two? So, I don't think we would in any way want to push the private sector out or do what they're doing. But there are some places where, I think it's very hard for the private sector to engage with freshmen if you don't know what their major is going to be. And so maybe there is a role that we can play there. But it oftentimes, the hardest thing is to get the student through the first year. And sometimes the promise of an income share agreement at the junior year isn't soon enough. We've also, we think that there could be benefits to institutions where, there are not parents who can or will take Parent Plus loans. Could you use this to fill that gap so that the student takes on the responsibility instead of the parent who is, nearing retirement age? So there's all different ways that we can look at it. And again, we would never want to displace the private sector, but we do think there are places where the private sector won't go. And that's what we're looking at.
I think it's time for us to switch over to audience questions, and I know there are some microphones circulating around if people want to get up and ask a question. Yes, sir.
Sure. Hi, Brian Bridges, UNCF. Oh, thank you. Brian Bridges, UNCF. I have several questions. I'll try not to pepper you with too many of them, but my primary question is about the creditor's role in school closures. Mm-hmm. And what do you see their role as? I know there's some people who feel as though they should sort of do no harm and have kind of a Hippocratic oath to help facilitate institutions' path toward improvement, and then there are others who feel as though they should be judge, jury, and executioner. Mm-hmm. Where do you kind of fall along that spectrum? And then following up on that, since most of the closures affect low-income institutions and low-income students, is there a concern around equity issues since that's such a hot-button topic in our current society?
Sure. So I'll answer the first question. There are silver linings, lessons learned through all of this. So I will say that, and Barbara Brittingham can disagree with me if she so chooses, but I think the silver lining in these closures is that it really made us realize that the triad needs to work together more closely. So I think that there had been a movement in the direction of finger pointing. You know, whose fault is it? Is it the creditor's fault? Is it the department's fault? Is it the state's fault? And I think the department drove some of that finger pointing. And I think now we've decided that we need to be a better participant in the triad. So for example, with some of the closures that happened recently, you know, the accreditors and I were on the phone every other week for an update. And that was helpful because when one accreditor found a problem, we could share it with all the accreditors, and we could solve those problems together. And let's face it, sometimes if the accreditor felt like they weren't getting a response, we might have been able to get a more rapid response because we hold the purse. So, and states as well. We started doing calls with all of the state authorizing agencies. So I do think there was a situation in the past where, you know, it was like the middle school dance. Everybody sat in their corner to figure who was going to go first. I think now we're in much more close communication so that we can work through these things together and share information. And work together to take the appropriate action at the appropriate time. The other thing that we built into the negotiator rulemaking that just completed is there's a provision in statute that says that the department can choose to not recognize the accreditation of an institution that in the event of an adverse action sues the accreditor without going through mediation first. We have put that provision into our regs. We think that it is good to have that as a first step. So we've also added mediation as a requirement. So you know, and it is so difficult to look at these scenarios and know, like, when do you decide that the institution really can't turn it around? You know, these are very difficult decisions, and there isn't some magic indicator that pops up and says now's the time. So they are difficult decisions to make. But the idea is let's get teach-out plans and teach-out agreements in place earlier. It is a much less difficult decision to make if the students are not going to be harmed, if they're going to have an opportunity to complete their program or have their loan forgiven. So we think by working more closely together and having earlier teach-out plans and agreements, everybody can win. And of course, we're concerned about equity issues. You know, open enrollment institutions oftentimes are the institutions that have financial challenges. They oftentimes are serving lower income students. I think there is one narrative out there that says, well, then the best thing for those students is close their program and give them their money back. But what we hear from students more often than not is what they really want is to complete their program. They chose their school, they love their school, their faculty are supportive. And so there's this, I think, a false narrative that, well, just give them their money back. But I think, you know, low-income students are oftentimes juggling work and family and school, and there's an exhaustion factor, and they want to complete. So, but it is true that schools with large endowments serve small numbers of low-income students and are protected against financial ups and downs because they have large endowment holdings. And we certainly would love to see well-endowed institutions serve larger proportions of low-income students. That would be a wonderful way to, you know, bring more equity to higher ed.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm Frank Ballman, NASCAP. Thanks for coming today. I want to ask a question about income share agreements, but from a different perspective. Because we have 7 million unfilled jobs in the country today. So I'm wondering if, given that, say, a negotiation between a 18-year-old kid or a 20-year-old kid and whoever, now 99% of kids are not sophisticated enough to understand whether income share agreement is a good deal. Why not have a public-private partnership where the provider of the funds to pay for the education is corporations, for example, and the trade-off is they get X% of the future income taxes the student generates, since, you know, we all know a college degree is worth $1 million more in lifetime earnings. So
some college degrees are.
Right.
Let's be clear.
Some are worth more, some are
Worth less,
but,
exactly.
Right. But and that ultimately gets to my ultimate point, which is private corporations won't invest in worthless degrees, but they will invest heavily in worthwhile degrees, and they'll bid down what % of the tax revenue they need. So I'm wondering if you've thought about income share or revenue share agreements that aren't, the student is not a party, but just sort of the invisible hand of the private sector guiding students to the worthwhile degrees you mentioned?
Well, so first I want to be clear that just because a degree generates or supports an occupation that it doesn't lead to a six-figure income does not mean it's a worthless degree. So I want to be abundantly clear. There are many students who pursue careers in the liberal arts, careers in public service, careers in healthcare, below the level of nursing, social work, education. There are a number of incredibly worthwhile programs that simply don't generate high earnings. And so I want to be careful because I think the term worthless has been thrown around a little bit loosely. I think that it would be wonderful if companies participated. I think it would be wonderful if companies agreed to help pay down the income share agreement. So I think there are all kinds of opportunities where companies can partner with institutions. But even there, my guess is that companies are going to want to invest in a junior or a senior, not a freshman, right? Because many times as a freshman, they haven't declared a major. In an apprenticeship program, these are selective, right? The company's going to decide who they want to support through an apprenticeship. So maybe in the context of apprenticeship is where we'll see more of these arrangements where the companies step up in advance. So I think it's a great idea. I think that those will happen. We don't make loans to private sector organizations, and so I don't know that we could have a process like that. But I think it's a great opportunity. There are some private lenders out there that are working on these kinds of agreements between employers and institutions. So there are private lenders who are working on those kinds of arrangements. They don't include us. We're not a party to them. And we spend a lot of time talking about preparing students for occupations. But I want to make it clear, we think there's tremendous value in the other parts of higher education that you perhaps can't put a price tag on. And so I don't want to leave people with the idea that we think it's only worthwhile if it leads to a particular occupation and pays a six-figure income.
Right. I think we can probably sneak in one more question. I have one question of my own that I forgot to ask. And one thing that's been in the news lately is the department's backlog of borrower defense claims. Yep. I know the secretary was asked repeatedly about this on the Hill a few weeks ago. Does the department have a plan to address the backlog of claims, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, so the department, unfortunately, is waiting for a court ruling. And so we had a methodology for determining partial relief for students that deserve some relief but not total loan forgiveness. And that methodology was challenged by the court. And so where there are students that are likely eligible for partial relief, we're stuck. We're in a holding pattern. We are continuing to move forward to process if a student should get 100% relief or if they are not eligible. We're going to continue work through those. But until we have clear direction from the court or a different methodology that we think doesn't run the same challenges, yes, we are in a holding pattern for students who are probably eligible for partial relief because the methodology has been, the courts have said we need to look at this. So
and this is waiting on the Ninth Circuit?
Yes, the Ninth Circuit, yeah.
Are you working on a different methodology? I think the department has said in court filings that it's working on a different way at getting some of this information. That's in the works.
It's in the works, but I think people have to understand that the department doesn't have access to IRS data right now. I mean, we're trying to get it. We don't have access to Social Security Administration data. So we need to partner with other agencies, or we'd love to see the opportunity for us to hook data systems up to the IRS, and I think there's been some legislation that has looked at that issue. I think what we don't want to do is require borrowers to provide us with tons and tons of their own financial information. We're worried about the burden associated with that. So yeah, we are looking at other methods, but we have limited access to data. We don't want to be overly burdensome to borrowers, and we are still waiting for the Ninth Circuit. So I don't have any news. We don't have a new methodology that we've landed, but we are reviewing other options.
Okay. I think we have 2 minutes left for, yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm from the National Governors Association. So no surprise, I'm going to ask about the role of states.
Yes.
Many times the states are the ones left holding the bag on things like records and teach-out plans and dealing with the students day to day. So have some of these catastrophic closures taught you and have some lessons learned about the role of the states in all of this, which I think is many times left out when we're talking about accreditors and feds.
Yeah.
And something that goes beyond just communicating better person to person, but really baking the role of the states into some of this, your lessons learned around closure.
Sure. So one of the lessons learned is that we were not having regular phone calls with the state authorizers, and so we initiated those. So we do have regular calls now with the state authorizers. And when we were in crisis, we were having not just the regular quarterly call, but we were having lots and lots of calls so that states could share information with each other, with us. States are usually the ones that are most aggressive in identifying teach-out partners because they know what's on the ground. We are all trying to work through records management issues. Sometimes landlords get involved, right? So we are working together. I was at the conference last week of state authorizing organizations, and for example, one of the questions they asked that we're going to look at is, could some of the letter of credit funds be made available for the purpose of records storage or records maintenance? And so we certainly, I heard that loudly and clearly and took it back, and so we're looking at that. It came up during rulemaking that some states felt as though NC SARA was interfering with states' ability to have tuition recovery funds. We don't negotiate, we don't regulate NC SARA, but ACE and the SHIO, David T. from the SHIO organization has agreed to convene a meeting to actually talk about, how can NC SARA make sure that, the needs of states have been heard. So that'll be separate from us. I think we have gotten those conversations started, and we're looking to see if we could do more. What's sad is in the more recent closure, we had worked together with states in advance. We all had identified institutions that were willing to accept and wanted to accept the students and hire the faculty. In the case of one of them, unfortunately, we have one programmatic accreditor who has still not notified anybody whether they've approved teach-out agreements or not. This is several months later, and students and institutions and faculty are still waiting. And that's just too long, and it's just not helpful to students. And so I think the states are frustrated because they worked really hard to have teach-out fairs and identify partners, and now here we all sit waiting. So we have a lot more we can do, but I do think we've learned, and I do think we're trying to address many of the requests that we've gotten.
I see we have a red light blinking.
Okay.
So I just want to thank you so much
Bill
for...
at the podium.
Oh,
So.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time
Thank you.
to have
Thank
this
you, Michael.
conversation.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Look, second panel, go ahead and join. Okay. We have another panel here to continue this discussion on particularly on school closures, an expert panel here. As we've already heard, when colleges close, their students face some bleak prospects. Their time, tuition, dollars are often go to waste, and many struggle to transfer those credits to another institution. As an old budgeteer, there's also a taxpayer issue here because if those loans are discharged, that's a cost to the federal government. I've heard 6,000 schools. I've seen 4,300 schools. I don't know colleges and universities, but whatever it is, I was struck by a Moody's report recently that's given U.S. higher education systems a negative outlook for 2 consecutive years due to rising expenses and revenue constraints stemming from low growth and revenue shortfalls, tuition revenues. We talked about the high profile for-profit chains such as ITT Tech, maybe Argosy University. They've all tended to dominate the headlines. Private liberal arts schools are also seeing an uptick in recent closures. If my statistics are correct, at least if I believe the website, 100 for-profits have closed between the 2017-20, but also a number of nonprofit colleges have also shuttered, at least 20 to 30 between 2017 and 2018 academic. This panel is going to dig deep into those headlines and explore more policy dimensions on this issue. Moderating this discussion is Rick Seltzer from Inside Higher Ed. He'll introduce the panelists. Previously, Rick was a reporter with the Baltimore Business Journal and Central New York Business Journal. Also, he was a business reporter with Bloomington Herald-Times back in my home state of Indiana, and a graduate of Syracuse University. Rick will introduce the panel, and once again, Rick will leave time for audience questions at the end of the panel discussion before we close. So, Rick, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill. One of the wonderful things about this panel is we have a diversity of perspectives here, and we have the opportunity to back out a little bit and set the stage to say, how did we get to this point before we dive into some of the deeper policy discussions. Bill mentioned a Moody's report that was recent. I wanted to bring up a Moody's report from 2015 that predicted the closure rate of private nonprofit colleges, which at the time was about 5 per year, that rate would triple or could triple by 2017. Didn't quite get there. It hit 11 or so annually as of last year, and Moody's reiterated the rate is expected to keep going up. Meanwhile, you have Harvard business professor Clayton Christensen, who issued a famous prediction that many of you probably heard of back in 2011, that as many as half of American private nonprofit colleges would close within 10 to 15 years. He was recently challenged to a bet over that prediction by the president of Alfred University in upstate New York, who obviously didn't buy that version of the future. So what exactly is driving all this discussion? How's it likely to unfold? And what, if anything, then can the different parties, accreditors, regulators at the state and federal level think about doing beyond what we've discussed already? That's what I want to unpack here. And we have a great panel to address those issues. Joining me directly to my left is Barbara Brittingham, who's president of the New England Commission of Higher Education, regional accreditor. And then we have Michael Dakduk, Executive Vice President and Director of Government Relations at Career Education Colleges and Universities. It's a trade group representing for-profit universities. Richard Ekman, President of the Council of Independent Colleges, a group of small, private, nonprofit institutions. Robert Kelchin, Assistant Professor of Higher Education Policy at Seton Hall University. And Dan Zabel, Vice President and Chief Counsel of the National Student Legal Defense Network. So to start, Robert, I wonder if you actually wouldn't mind setting the stage a little bit for us and just walk us through what you see happening in the marketplace right now that is driving closures and rising concern about them.
Sure. So in general, it's a tough marketplace out there for most of higher education, particularly non-selective institutions. And this cuts across public, private, nonprofit, and for-profit institutions. The demographics facing higher education are a challenge in much of the country. Birth rates have declined for the pool of traditional age students. Colleges are getting very concerned about the baby bust following the Great Recession and what that means a few years from now. They're also concerned about adult students going into the workforce, not going to college as much, which happens when the economy is good. And then also among students going to college, there's more financial need. Full pay students are not what they used to be, and colleges are struggling to make the numbers work. And I'm skeptical of the number of closures that will happen. I think the Clayton Christensen bet is a pretty easy one for a college leader to take, but there are definitely concerns that colleges face. They want to stay open, but in many cases it's difficult to do.
Great. And Rich, I know you've often taken issue with some of the doomsday predictions. So what's your pushback or what's your take on them as we stand right now?
Well, understand that I'm the cheerleader for 656 smaller private nonprofit colleges and universities, which altogether account for some 15 to 20% of undergraduate education in the United States. You know, back 25 years ago when tuition discount rates soared to about 25%, commentators said this is unsustainable. All these colleges are going to go out of business. And the discount rate has continued to creep up, and it's now around 50%. And yet the number of actual closures is very small. It's even more dramatic than what Michael started us out with this morning. If you look at 30 years, you'll find that the number of college closures per year has never exceeded 10, and in some years it's 0. And this in spite of this rising discount rate and predictions of doom. So, and moreover, if you try to correlate the years when the number was closer to 10 than it was to 0, it doesn't correlate with things like the 2008 recession or any other event that would obviously explain it. Now this year it is true that the number has gone over 10. And if we're having this conversation here 2 years from now, and the number has been above 10 and is climbing, then I would change my perspective. But looking back over 30 years of history, it appears that at least the nonprofit colleges and universities are amazingly adaptable, raising money from private sources and by and large continuing to operate well.
Dan, I wonder if you could bring us the students' perspective a little bit and just talk about, frankly, whether students should be concerned.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reality is that we've seen a lot of high-profile closures, and whether it's a small school or a big school, the fact remains is for a particular student, that closure is an amazingly disruptive event with long-lasting impact on their lives. We're talking about the student debt, we're talking about their housing situation, we're talking about spouse issues, childcare issues. I mean, this is sort of the range of things that go into this, and I think we've seen it best with I think it's been most pronounced in the Argosy and the Dream Center closure recently, with the kinds of impact that we've been seeing. And I think as an organization that hears from students every single day on this, the answer has to be in better preparation. That whether or not we can all debate whether it's going to be some small number or large number of schools that close over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but in reality, one closure causes problems for students. And I mean, I like to think of it, and it's I don't remember where I first heard this analogy, but I have kids, I have life insurance, I have a will, I have living wills, I have plans for if something should happen to me. I don't think there's a 5% chance that I'm going somewhere today or tomorrow or in the next 10 years, but I plan. And that's the kind of thing I think that we need to see schools doing, and we need to see, quite candidly, the Department of Education doing a better job in forcing schools and accreditors and states and everyone just having these conversations to make sure that students are protected.
Barbara, I want to give you a chance to weigh in now that the accreditors got called out just a little bit.
Yes, thank you. We have seen closures in New England this year. We're having 4 nonprofit institutions close and 1 for-profit institution closed earlier this year. And I think all the factors that my colleagues here have mentioned are important. And there's also been cases where if one little thing goes wrong, it's the tipping point for the school. So we had one institution that, unfortunately, the CFO embezzled money. And that's one of the schools that is closing now. So one little thing goes wrong and it pushes the school over the edge. I think the point about planning is a good one, and our commission has increased its encouragement, shall we say, and requests for schools to come up with teach-out plans and teach-out agreements. There is a general concern, I'm sure Rick may want to speak to this, about the self-fulfilling prophecy of having a school identified that where people lose confidence in it and it closes. These small schools, which in New England are the ones that have closed, are extremely important not only to the students but also to the employees and to the communities, because the families work there, and there are some very concerned communities in Vermont right now because of school closures.
Sure. And just to finish cycling through all the panelists to open up, I should ask, Michael, is this just a for-profit problem? We hear so much about the giant for-profit collapses. And I think we heard a little bit in the last panel about the nonprofit sector. But what maybe is different about the for-profit sector that has caused such high-profile issues right now?
Well, it's certainly not just a for-profit sector issue with college closures, and we've heard that from other panelists and on the previous discussion with Diane. There are nonprofit institutions that are closing as well, but there are more happening in this sector. and that's something that we've certainly acknowledged at our association. But it also wasn't a surprise to us, and I don't think it was a surprise to a lot of higher education experts. There was a great deal of scrutiny applied to this sector over the past decade, and certainly in the previous administration. There was certainly a desire to close institutions in this sector. So sometimes I tend to pause when individuals say, well, these are shocking or sudden closures that not everybody expected. No, there was a desire to close institutions in this sector, and it certainly has carried over to some leading individuals that are even candidate for president who have called for cutting off Title IV and federal aid to this entire sector. So some people have said, oh, the sector's kind of, they're crying foul. They're saying that they're being targeted. Well, actually, if you see how the rhetoric has changed over time and actually gotten worse, we actually now have a candidate for president who wants to completely eliminate the existence of this sector in higher education. At least she's open and honest about it, where in the past we have asked for some honest dialogue whether there is a place for this sector in post-secondary education. Because if there's a belief in that, then we can certainly have a conversation on how to reform closed schools. If there isn't a belief in that, then you're going to see more school closures because there's certain individuals, prominent individuals in decision-making positions, perhaps in future administrations, that want to wipe out schools in the sector.
Dan, would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think, when you say that it wasn't a surprise when some of the schools are closing, I think that is right. And some of it is just when when you have schools that have, you look at Corinthian colleges, you look at ITT, you look at some of the other high-profile closures. I think what you've seen when you look back is a swirl of events going on around them, financial instability, law enforcement investigations, that at the end, it's not a surprise. And I think what is a surprise is what is the moment of closure and what is causing sort of the house of cards to come tumbling down. But I think if you have increased communication around these issues, it's not going to be a surprise. And I think to Barbara's point about sort of do people run for the hills the moment you start talking about closure, I think part of that is why you need to start normalizing the conversation a little bit, to be a little more upfront. That this is, we're working to solve problems. We're not saying we're going to close, but here is our plan. Whether you're a big school, a small school, a financially sound school, a financially sort of bumpy school, we have a plan. We're thinking about these things. We're constantly putting the needs of schools first, such that closure doesn't become a dirty word. I think it's one thing that would help advance the ball.
Does talking about closure, Rich, in your opinion, have a potential, as Barbara mentioned earlier, to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where students will stay away from a place that has been in that closure conversation?
Yes, and it's aggravated by the media using a formula for writing about this of crisis and decline when, as we know, it's harder to get on page one with a good news story about the winning basketball team or the winning debate team. So that's a fact of life. For us, the big concern is how do you get the public to recognize that there's an ecosystem in each state that consists of state universities, private nonprofit universities, and in some states also the for-profits. And I look at Massachusetts as kind of an example in the first of the recent closures when Mount Ida announced suddenly that it was closed. The state created a channel for those students to transfer to UMass Dartmouth. UMass Dartmouth is 80 miles away from Mount Ida. There are literally 40 private nonprofit colleges and universities closer to the Mount Ida campus. And why more effort wasn't put into helping those students find their places in institutions that had similar educational philosophies as the small college that closed, Mount Ida, is kind of a mystery. And my fear is that the state systems see themselves somewhat in competition with the private nonprofit institutions in the state instead of working together cooperatively to provide residents of the states the best access to higher education. Now in Massachusetts, which is a very big private higher education state compared to many of the western and southern states, it's also an important industry in the state to keep private higher education strong. So it's all the more mystifying that in the Mount Ida case, certain things weren't done to build upon the underutilized capacity that many of the private colleges had in the state.
The Mount Ida case is a really interesting one. For any of you who haven't heard of it yet, it was a small private institution outside of Boston. There was discussion last year that it was going to merge with another institution. Things seem to be moving towards that, and then suddenly, for reasons that are, depending on who you ask, still up in the air, the bottom dropped out of that merger. And Mount Ida essentially had to close on short notice. I believe the administration was not invited or was disinvited from their graduation ceremonies. It was such an ugly situation. And there was a lot of turmoil about where the students were going to end up. Ultimately, UMass did end up with the campus. I believe there was some discussion about which UMass institution should have had the campus versus which one got it, where the students should end up, as Rich mentioned, versus where they were being allowed to go for teach out. Barbara, what did you learn through this process, or what would you add to my kind of
How long do we have?
Yeah,
So
right.
Massachusetts is willing and able to pay for robust state government. So government sprang into action. The governor submitted a bill. He submitted another bill right now. The Mass Board of Higher Education had a project that they called THESIS, which is an acronym. One of the S's stands for students. And they proposed a teach-out viability metric, which would, they would put every independent institution in Massachusetts through this, including some that are extremely wealthy. And if they determined by this metric that the school couldn't finish, by December, if they couldn't finish that year and the next one, the state would do something to take care of it, and not clear exactly what. It wouldn't surprise anybody in this room to hear that the independent colleges and universities are not thrilled about this plan. So we have been working with the state, with the legislature, with ACOM, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, to see if there's a way that we can cooperate more with the state. One of the big concerns is if the state does a process like this, it will become public information. And I think that's one of the things that the state, the independent colleges in particular, are the most worried about. I will say about why it closed, my fantasy about the afterlife is that we get to hear conversations that we were not privy to here. And I'm signing up for that one.
Robert, since we've waded into the area of state regulation, do you have any takes on what Massachusetts is doing, or this idea that we may end up with states taking new action to layer on new public disclosure or other levels of regulation for the closure process?
I think both states and the federal government are really focused on trying to get ahead of college closures. I think it's one of the few areas where there could be bipartisan action both in state houses and in Washington, D.C. But it's difficult when, as has been mentioned already, these colleges are often the largest employers in the community. They've been around a long time, and they have effective lobbying organizations. Students want to make this information public, colleges not necessarily so much, and maybe the compromise is using some kind of teach-out metric that catches a pretty large percentage of colleges and is framed in a way that they're not really at risk of closing, but it still can identify some of the lower performing institutions that then deserve some more scrutiny.
Dan, is there a level of information, in your estimation, that your students are asking for, of additional information? I get a lot of pushback when I talk about student disclosure from some folks who will say, well, what would you show the students that they would actually, an 18-year-old would actually be able to evaluate and say this college is on the brink or is safe or is not safe?
I mean, I think that's it's an interesting question, right? Because there is a risk of disclosures that, when you hand a student a 20-page, 8-point font disclosure list, like that doesn't help anyone. And I think I think everyone recognizes that. And I think that there are events that happen to a school that heighten the risk of closure, though, that students just need to be made aware of, whether it's the accreditor taking action against a school. That's something students should know, and that's something students should certainly know before they enroll at a school. If an accreditor is saying, hey, this school has X, Y, and Z problems, if I'm going to go to that school and make the decision to invest in that school, I'd like to think that I have a right to know that. Those are the kinds of things. It may not be saying, hey, closure, like sort of like a a closure risk, like the doomsday clock. Like I'm not suggesting something like that, but I do think that there are events that students should just be at least made aware of. And quite frankly, I think things like letters of credit are one of them. Students may not understand them, but states may, and accreditors do. And whether the department is holding a letter of credit is something that the higher ed marketplace, if you want to talk about having sort of an efficient economic marketplace for higher education, I think the free flow of information is a key component of that.
It's interesting. There was a case in New England. It was Lincoln College in New England. And it received show cause last year from its accreditor, asking it to prove why it shouldn't be placed on probation. It went through the process and ultimately was going to be placed on probation. But in May, when it received the initial notice, it disclosed through SEC filings to its investors that it had received that notice. It didn't end up telling students and faculty until August of that year. So I understand that there is a fiduciary duty or a duty of a for-profit company to disclose to its investors that in this case is actually different than what has to be disclosed to students. So I guess, Barbara, before I ask you to talk about that situation to the extent that you can, I do want to ask Michael about that, whether these institutions have any wiggle room there that are for-profits that are trying to thread this needle between federal regulations, investor regulations, state regulations, accreditor regulations?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that all for-profit institutions are not the same. I think a lot of times we talk about large, publicly traded companies when most institutions in the sector are small mom and pop, family-owned institutions. They've been in their communities for 50, sometimes 100 years. They're multi-generation, family-owned small businesses, essentially. But what you read about are large, publicly traded or investor-owned corporations. So I think that's a unique thing to keep in mind. With regulations and what's going on, here's what I know about closures in this sector. Generally speaking, there's something called heightened cash monitoring. And once you hit HCM2, and even the department is seeking wiggle room on this, we've heard that, it's pretty much a death sentence to the institution. You starve them of all their cash, they have no way of operating. But sometimes the department is put in a position where they have to put them on HCM2. So what we need to figure out is how do we keep the students in school and completing their programs? Because the students aren't thinking about HCM2, letters of credit. That is not what they think about. And that's actually why we looked at the FDIC model. If you're not familiar with the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, in looking at how they dealt with closed banks. And they dealt with this in the Great Depression, and there have been certain times when there's been an influx in closures in banks. And they've kind of figured out a model around that. So our institutions and leaders in our sector came together and said, let's look at how they do this with closed banks so that the consumer doesn't really experience it. Because here's what we know is wrong. Everybody agrees that students should not show up to a school with a padlock on it and a sticky note on the door. That much we all agree on. Doesn't matter what sector you're talking about. So if we can find a way to where we don't give an institution, even if it's a troubled institution, an immediate death sentence, if there's quality education still in place there, or get the students to another program at another institution, that's what we should be focused on. Because they're not thinking about HCM2 and letters of credit. I'm telling you, I think most of you understand that, but it's just not, it's not what the student thinks about, and the interruption in study, while closed school loan discharges are important, bar defense, all of that's important, most students are trying to complete their programs. So we have to figure out ways to fix regulations, the law, and HEA reauthorization to make sure that students are continuing their education and completing.
Barbara, before we get into what is a really interesting discussion on both the idea of students completing and on the idea of following the bank model, I want to give you a chance to comment on Lincoln and that situation.
Sure.
The Lincoln closure, I think, went about as good as it could. We were very lucky. The students were lucky. There was a school about 30 minutes away, Goodwin College, an independent college, and the president of Goodwin College and the gentleman from Lincoln Education Service knew each other, so they trusted each other. The programs were largely the same. The student body was quite similar. And so they worked out a way for Lincoln to teach one more semester while they worked out the details of the teach-out plan. It went well enough we had them speak about it in the meeting. It was a well-attended session. So I think that worked about as well as it could. I want to say a couple other things. One is, for 30 years, our commission has had a process to monitor the financial situation of financial institutions, and following the closure, we made some enhancements to that. I'd be happy to talk about if anybody is interested. But the other thing is, I observed some. Is that better? There we go. Is that working? Yes, that's good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I observed some of the negotiated rulemaking, and one of my favorite discussions was informing students of what's going on and the discussion about how to get students' attention these days. And it's not an easy matter. So it isn't just not handing them an 8-point, 30-page publication. It's any way to get their attention about things that are important. I think that's a real challenge.
You mentioned some of the changes. Just to follow up real quickly, would you mind talking about what you changed after that situation? Sure.
We had the higher education people from a couple of the big 2 accounting firms and a former official at Moody's come observe our committee process to do this. We added more information on the covenants that banks have on loans. We added information on cash flow. We moved up the date of the annual report that every institution fills so that the information is available to the commission before the end of the semester. So we enhanced a project that I think is already working pretty well.
That's interesting. So the idea, this gets at another question I wanted to ask, which was whether any of these bodies really get the information early enough. I think it came up in the last session, whether it's financial scores or annual reports or anything else, whether there are weak points in the information system.
Right, and that's one reason why we're trying to work with the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, because they would be relying on information from the federal government, which, as Diane says, comes to them late. We can get information from the institution as soon as the enrollment date closes, as soon as the audit is done, and so we've timed our processes to get information that's as current as possible and get it as quickly as possible.
Robert, are there other weak points in kind of the flow of information between bodies that you would identify?
I think the key point is that just so much of the data end up coming so late. We just got the new financial responsibility scores posted for fiscal years ending 2016, 2017. That's slightly out of date, and it's the best measure that we have for financial health at this point. I think looking more at real-time measures of enrollment is useful for most tuition-driven colleges, and then trying to get some rough measure of tuition revenue or tuition discounting, perhaps even before the audited financials are closed. Something like that I think will be more useful identifying colleges that are at risk now instead of colleges that were at risk, say, 3 years ago.
Before we get too far away from the idea that was brought up on modeling something after the FDIC, this is an interesting idea. I remember the first time I covered a bank that had been closed. And essentially what happens is the regulators come in on a Friday night after business closes, they take everything, and they have a buyer lined up. And they transfer the assets, and the bank reopens as a new bank on Monday morning. Rich, let me ask first. I would imagine that maybe there would be some concerns from your members about that kind of a model.
Yeah. I'd never heard the FDIC model proposed as a solution to the problem of colleges in serious trouble. It's an interesting one. I'd need to think about that. I can think of several more benign steps that could be taken. I think everybody in this room knows that a state university receives its money from several different pots. One is the big pot for operating the core functions of the institution, and one of the other pots is a per capita allocation for each student who enrolls. In Massachusetts, that's a pretty high number. It's over $7,000 per student. What would happen if some of those students were shunted to other institutions? Even half that per capita amount traveled with them to help with the cost of education at either a nonprofit or even a for-profit. That would not be quite so scary. It would provide some relief to the institution involved. And I also think that whereas you can look at the balance sheet for a nonprofit or a for-profit college and university and draw your own conclusions, it's harder to look at the equivalent of a balance sheet for a state university. And in some of the northeastern states where the public systems were really expanded very rapidly in the 60s and 70s, but now the demographic projections are down. What's the accountability tool that you use to help make a decision that a branch of the state system ought to close or be reduced in size or merge with another institution? I don't know, Barbara, if you've got a handle on those tools, but when you look at Pennsylvania, for example, where there are state colleges in the western part of the state that have had precipitous drops in enrollment over a long period of time, and where the state legislature actually talked about closing some of those colleges, it's hard to bring closure to that. It's hard to know what standard to use to make the decision.
Barbara, did you?
Yeah, I would say in the last few years we've started working much more closely with state systems in some of the New England states, and it is somewhere between difficult and impossible to close a state institution.
Caught again.
State institution, is that better? Sorry about that. So in Connecticut, Middlesex Community College a few years ago decided that it was going to close one of its branch instructional locations, and because of the rules they needed to bring the teach-out plan to us, the commission approved it, and then the state legislature passed a law saying to Middlesex Community College, no, you're not going to close that instructional location. So that's not even closing a school, it's closing an instructional location. So I think what we've been trying to do is to work with the state systems to see how we can work with them given what the realities are. And in Maine, for example, they have talked about the possibility of having a system accreditation that would let them make, to the extent possible, educational opportunities available to the people of Maine and keep all those campuses open. And I think it's a plan that has a lot to be said for it in Maine.
Dan, maybe this is a good chance to just back up a little bit and ask, I mean, when institutions close, do you have any sense of how many students end up not transferring at all or not continuing their education? It sounds like, based on all we've heard, it can be a very confusing process.
I mean, I don't have exact data off the top of my head. I think it's, my sense is it's a lot, particularly in some of the larger schools, the for-profit schools, where you just have a different kind of population, online programs, where you don't have students who are all living, you know, a residential closure, I think we could probably all agree, is going to be a very different thing and a very different beast than, you know, a non-residential campus. Just there are a whole, you know, slews of issues, and both in terms of, you know, what happens to students in housing and also just the ability to communicate with students. I do think, and I want to make sure a couple points don't get lost. And I think we probably, it sounds like there's a lot of agreement here that there are problems with the federal composite score and that whole process, and that it is a lagging metric. You know, it does seem like the kind of thing that, you know, I mean, I know from my time at the Department of Education, there was an ability to get sort of real-time cash flow analyses and cash flow projections from schools, and those are things that can be used, you know, in place of, or at least as sort of a, you know, some way of keeping an eye on what's going on with the school that people think, you know, is at risk of closure, and to just try and track that. So that's one thing I think that actually states and accreditors could do as well. And then the other thing that I think, you know, we saw a lot of after the closure of ITT particularly was huge issues with transcripts and student records, and how it is that students can make sure that they are getting their records and getting the records that they're really entitled to. And some of them are electronic, some of them are 15 years old, and they were literally in boxes, you know, at campuses and storefronts sort of all over the country. And I think that's another thing that states, accreditors, and the department really have to tackle, and whether it's sort of pre-funding management programs or requiring electronic records that have some way of living on beyond the school, I think that's something that really, in terms of when you're looking at student impact, is something that could have a huge, huge benefit for students, and are fairly, I think, uncontroversial.
Would you advocate for one of those parties taking a lead on that? It strikes me that we're bouncing between different parts of the triad here an awful lot.
I would tend to think the question is really going to come down to funding and who has the ability to fund a program that would allow transcripts to live on and be accessible going forward. And one, I think, option is just simply to require a school to pre-fund it.
Michael, Michael, could you go?
Yeah, I would actually add that we probably find common ground here. In one of our proposals we put out in 2017 for reauthorization of HEA, over 70 leaders in our sector came together on an HEA task force, and they talked about school closures in this issue and how to keep students in their programs of study and completing. We actually committed to a $5 per student, which would, I think, based on the latest enrollments, be roughly around $10 million annually, to focus on a continuing education fund. So, and this is just for our sector. And it would, right now, the way our proposal is drafted, is that this would be at the Department of Education. Now, we could certainly have a conversation about that, but the willingness to fund and support some sort of initiative to keep students enrolled, transcripts transferred, information that's relayed between the triad and other parties, we're fully on board with, and we're actually willing to self-fund that. And that kind of goes back to the FDIC model, where there's a premium paid to cover depositors, the consumers. We recognize, okay, we can do that. We can step up and do it. And I give credit to the 70 sector leaders that came together and said, yeah, we will fund that and we will commit to it.
I think just to jump in, it all comes back to planning, and it all comes back to not being caught off guard when these things happen, because at the moment where the padlock is on the door of the school, it's too late. Landlords come in, they want to take back their space. That ship has sailed at that point.
And Barbara, I think you wanted to jump in too.
Sure, just two quick things. One, for the last 4 or 5 years, we have a page on closed and merged institutions that basically tells where the transcripts are, and it's been the second most popular page on our website for about 4 years. Probably getting more popular by the minute. The other is the state of Vermont is working on, the private institutions in Vermont are working on legislation to submit to the state that would look after transcripts, because a few years ago they had a school close and they had to figure it out.
Robert, I wonder if you have thoughts on the $5 surcharge idea, that closed school fund.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. First of all, from an accountability perspective, it's really smart for the sector to propose that, to get out ahead of any potential regulations. But it makes some sense if we get the premium amount right. And I would also say that this probably fits better with states, because there should probably also be something in place for colleges that aren't getting Title IV money. And I worry a little bit about some accreditors continuing on in operation. And I think that states, just because there are 50 of them and there are a lot of specialized accreditors, that states might be the best way to go on this.
Dan, I see you nodding.
I'm not,
just agreement.
Accreditors are not also, they don't seem to be going anywhere for the most part, but there is always that possibility too. I think Robert raises an excellent point with non-Title IV schools. I don't know of a state that has ever shut down. And so I think that would, it's just sort of, if you're talking about longevity, that seems to be the place to do it.
And while we're on the topic of places to go, or let's talk about places to go, we have new department consensus rules that look like they're there. Robert, is there anything in there that you think will work better or will not work as well?
I think a lot still remains to be determined with the final rules. I think paying more attention to teach outs is a really valuable thing, but I'll wait for the draft rules to really say more on this.
Now, I think Diane, the Department of Education, I believe there are a few negotiators in the room today, deserve a lot of credit. They reached consensus. You think back at the last time that's happened, and there are some real solid provisions in here related to this issue that we're discussing, including the white knight provision for institutions that are taking over a closing or closed institution. It allows them to come in, take over the institution under specific circumstances. So there are restrictions associated with it. It's not like an unhealthy school can come in and take over the closing or closed institution. I think that's important. The discussions around teach-out plans, and there's triggering events that they've looked at. That's important. So there are certain things that are now going to come in a final rule, but you can look at it. This information is publicly available. The redlined versions and edits that they have made to the regulations, and you can see what's coming. You can get a sense of what's coming and the thinking behind it to keep students in school. I'm really a fan of the continuation of the flow of Title IV for 120 days under specific circumstances to keep students in school on track to complete their degree.
Barbara, would the triggering events help you as an accreditor?
I think so. I need to go back and take a look at them, but I think these. Unfortunately, we're learning a lot about this, and so part of what we want to do is consolidate what we've learned from these schools that are going through this process.
I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea that came up in the previous session that students should be kept in school, or we want to keep the students in school as opposed to offering them loan discharge. Very open-ended to start, I guess. Dan, I mean, do you have thoughts on that process, that discussion?
I mean, I think from my perspective, there are situations where staying in school probably makes sense, and there are situations where taking a closed school loan discharge also makes a lot of sense. And it is a very fact-dependent situation depending on the school, depending on the student. But I think the options is what, and allowing a student to have those options. And one of the concerns I have with sort of allowing schools to keep going is what that does to a student's right to a closed school discharge, given that the way the regs are framed, it's, the school has to cease operating educational activities in all programs. The secretary has the discretion to sort of go back, but the real question is at the time of closure or at the time of announced closure, can a student say, all right, I've learned enough, I want to walk away, this is not good, I'm in my first semester, I'm in my last semester, and I heard that I've now learned things that tell me that I do not want to spend another dime at this place, even if Robert might come to a different conclusion about in that same circumstance. So I think students have to be given choices, and I think the regulations have to allow for that. And that's one of my concerns with letting schools continue beyond sort of with Title IV funding is, can it be done in a way that allows students to exercise their choices? Which I think this administration has sort of talked a lot about student choices in education, and I'd like to see that trickle down into this space too.
Robert, any ideas on balancing those things?
So first of all, for some bizarre reason, I'm getting Facebook ads for Argosy PsyD programs closing and encouraging me to go to another institution, a nonprofit institution that's willing to cooperate. That baffles me why I'm targeted, but I think it really is a case-dependent thing for students as to what's best, but it's a tough job for the department balancing students and taxpayers and trying to protect both groups reasonably well. And case-by-case decisions are great, except when we have tens of thousands of students the department's trying to deal with, and case-by-case also ends up with lawsuits. So best of luck to the department on that.
Rich, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, stepping way back, taking the macro view, I would think that the national interest is in having more people get a college education and prepared for the workforce as efficiently as possible. That is, with the least burden on the taxpayers and the least delay in the person's entry into the workforce and earning money. So starting with that premise and working back from that, it would be great if there were tremendous flexibility in what happens to a student who's Title IV when he moves to another institution. That would be the ideal thing. And I don't know enough about the actual details of the administration of those funds to be able to go further in commenting on it. But that, it seems to me, would pursue what is really in the country's overall best interest.
Barbara, did you want to add anything on that? I saw you writing something down.
Yeah, 2 points that are a little bit related maybe. One is when schools close, in our experience, sometimes the state can tell students that you shouldn't go here, but the truth of the matter is these institutions have college fairs so that students have choice, and there are other institutions that are very willing and able to take them over so that students feel like they have that kind of support and choice. The other thing is that the other area that our commission focused on after Mount Ida was the importance of governing boards and the reality conversation, having that early enough, because the possibility of closure or even merger is not something that a lot of boards want to take on. And this extends somewhat to public boards, but principally to independent boards. And we don't have that many for-profit boards in New England, but I've spent more time in the last year talking to governing boards. I've been invited to campuses to give the reality talk to faculty. So I think figuring out how to have that conversation within the institution, and particularly with the governing board, is really important.
Rich, do you have any tips on that, on that conversation with the governing boards?
Well, I agree with Barbara that it's essential that the governing board get engaged and be given a reality check on what they're facing. When you look at the actual mergers that have taken place within the nonprofit sector and those that have failed after lengthy discussions, it's hard to generalize about what causes success or failure in this arena. There are 2 Catholic colleges in New York State, for example, that had discussions at the governing board level for 2 years about merger and then in the end decided not to do it. And the best explanation that I could come up with, and it may be right and may be not, that these represent 2 different segments of the Catholic leadership community in that metropolitan area. So in other words, a culture difference rather than anything objectively related to the finances of the institution. But Barbara's absolutely right that getting the governing boards involved early matters.
I'm struck. I think of a situation that's kind of unfolding right now. Again, Barbara, in your region, it's an institution which announced plans to merge or seek a merger partner, and they stopped admitting new students. And then the president was ousted. Alumni were angry. And now it looks like they're going to try to keep going. So there are students who are still enrolled. There are students who presumably will be coming in the fall, and they've just had this giant change in control. How do you, as an accreditor, deal with a situation like that, which is an institution that doesn't even seem to be able to figure out, or wasn't able to figure out, where it wanted to go going forward?
This would be Hampshire College. Yes, and it's a very special institution. They announced they had their comprehensive evaluation a year ago this spring, and the commission, seeing that there was some decline in enrollment, some financial challenges, asked for a report this spring. The enrollment in the fall was worse than they had anticipated, so the outgoing president called the incoming president to deliver the bad news after she'd accepted the job. And she and the board, when she arrived, looked at the situation and felt that it wasn't sustainable in the long run, and so announced the plans to merge. And this speaks to what happens with extreme openness, I think. They were very candid with everybody on campus and off campus. Students moved in and took over the campus, her office rather. She at one point resigned, so there is an interim president who has had a long time association with the institution. Our commission has asked them to come in and show cause why they shouldn't be placed on probation or have their accreditation withdrawn. We will see them. They are very energetic. It's a very passionate community. It's a wonderfully individualized flavor of education that I, speaking personally, hope stays in the landscape of higher education. But they have real challenges there.
Yeah, Rich, did you
Yeah,
want to weigh in?
just to make the point that demography is not destiny here, nor is finances. That leadership matters. And making the right choices to how to approach a problem at the level of the president and the board can make all the difference in the world. I can point to 2 superficially similar colleges in small towns in Michigan. One is thriving, one is tanking, and it's just the vision and the execution by the leadership of the institution that makes the difference.
We're about to go to questions, but Dan, I want to give you the last word on this when we're dealing with these really knotty issues. How do you recommend leaders keep the student perspective in mind?
I think it's openness and transparency, both from the student side, the state side, the accreditor side, and the Department of Education side. And I think it's, as I've said, a couple times now, it's advanced planning and recognizing that it's not just the institution that's at stake. It's actually student lives that are at stake, and that these are things that will have an impact long into students' futures.
Great. Well, I think we're going to questions now. And again, just like last time, folks will be bringing microphones around. So once I call on you, if you just want to wait a second, we'll get you a mic and then everyone can hear. So do we have questions at this point? Don't be shy. Yeah, as Barbara said, they said nothing controversial. Yes.
Hi, Brian Bridges, UNCF again. So you guys talked around the merger issue, and to Dan's point about planning, should mergers be more of a structured part of the potential move toward, instead of closing? There was a period of time in the country's higher ed system where mergers happened a lot more often. And now Georgia's kind of been taking the lead and merging some of their institutions. So the question I have is, should mergers be part of a systematic approach when one of those kind of alarm bells go off? Should mergers be facilitated by the accreditor, or should that be something that should be part of the rulemaking? Just a question that I wanted to see what people thought about.
Barbara, you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think Georgia is the public system mergers, and that's a whole different dynamic. But within the independent sector, I think it goes back to the governing board, because the governing board really has to wake up early enough with the president and say, here's our runway, and we're still an attractive asset academically, and we don't have such deep financial problems that nobody wants to merge with us and use that as an opportunity. I would say we've got several of them in New England, and the poster child recently has been Wheelock College merging with Boston University.
Rich?
The generalization I would make is that when two similar institutions decide to merge, it's very hard to pull it off. But when dissimilar institutions decide to merge and have complementary strengths, it's often easier. And Wheelock BU is certainly an example of that.
And Georgia, too, the way Georgia's doing it in the
Yes.
public sector.
Others on the panel with thoughts, or does that cover it?
Well, I would say that, again, going back to the negotiated rulemaking that reached consensus, there's the locations of closing institutions, and this is what we referred to as the white knight provision, where a financially healthy institution could come in and take over. So not necessarily a merger, but an acquisition, per se. So you're coming in, and there are certain restrictions, I know in our sector, where institutions wouldn't touch it because they're considered toxic sites. They wouldn't touch institutions. They don't want the liabilities that are associated with it. A great way to think of it, I think Diane mentioned this before, is imagine if you went to go buy a house and you had to have all of the liabilities and debt of the previous homeowner. So you're not really going to have institutions that want to come forward, take over those institutions. But there are institutions that want to do that. Very solid, financially healthy institutions that want to work with other institutions. So there's some wiggle room now in the provisions that the previous negotiated rulemaking reached consensus on.
Yeah.
So actually, just to that point, and I think it's a little bit of an imperfect analogy, because when you buy a house, you also buy a homeowner's insurance and you buy title insurance. And again, these are things that you think about in advance to plan for these scenarios. And so, why is it that, the American taxpayer can bear the brunt of that, and are we all insuring that? Or is the company that's going to be taking this asset on, presumably, at least in the for-profit sector, for a profit, why are they allowed to then just sort of, wipe out the liabilities of the prior institution? Maybe there should be some sort of pre-funding of a requirement, a letter of credit that holds that liability there, akin to title insurance or akin to homeowners policy.
Keep in mind the letters of credit already exist. Let's all remember that piece, and it can be a requirement from the Department of Education. I also want to go back to the FDIC model, where the first thing the FDIC looks to do is to make sure that a healthy bank can take over the closed bank, so that there's no disruption in the lives of consumers. I think that's what we're trying to get to, and we're willing to have conversations about that, and we're actually willing to fund it with the $5 per student fee.
Other questions?
Diane had one.
Oh, I think she had.
Or did the secretary want to jump in, and then we have a question back there, but I think for fairness that makes sense. Yes.
So I just want to make it clear that the white knight provision provides some liabilities for a new institution. It does not remove the liabilities from the closing institution. So there will continue to be an audit. The closing school will have those liabilities. It's just not transferring them to the new institution. And you're right, Michael, we do still oftentimes require a letter of credit for the insurance policy. But I want to make it clear that we're not absolving the liabilities, we're actually putting them in the right place.
And then, yes, I think it was back here. We'll get the microphone right to you.
Bankruptcy.
Thanks. I'm David Halperin. I want to ask Dan, some of these schools were enrolling students almost to the bitter end, knowing they were in trouble, knowing they were going to close, to keep on bringing in money, which is what they needed to survive. I'm just wondering, because I don't think there's been enough discussion of these students. They're your clients. Could you tell us more about some of these students and the impact on their lives of the closings and the way the closings were handled?
Sure. I mean, it's an excellent question. Unfortunately, the answer is heart-wrenching, as we have clients now who are literally homeless because of the closures of Argosy University. That is what it is, right? And these are people who planned their financial future around this school being open, and they didn't take jobs. They decided to go to school to better their lives and better their economic success. And one of those is, they are entitled to living expenses from their Title IV loans. And when that dries up, it doesn't matter that the Department of Education is going to forgive the loan. They need the money, and they need the money now because they need to feed their kids. And this is we can all sit here and talk about the FDIC and letters of credit and insurance and very sort of high level topics, but these are things that have very, very, very real effects on people right now who truly don't know how they're going to feed their families. And that's one of the things I think we should all, and I appreciate the question, because you can't have this conversation. And Michael Vasquez from the Chronicle of Higher Education wrote a piece about this a couple weeks ago now, and I would highly encourage, if anyone hasn't read it, to the moment you leave here to read it.
Anyone else with questions? Don't make me start another line. I think you want to go over there first? Okay.
Yeah, Shelley Repp here. No one has mentioned the college promise and free college movements and what the potential there to affect the trend line of what you've been talking about here, and what it means for the need to get even further ahead of the problems that you've been talking about today.
Well, I think if you can tell me what's going to happen in the next election, I can give you a sense of what might happen in the post-secondary education environment. There's mixed reviews in our sector, but there's actually a lot of us in our sector that are our member institutions that don't shy away from the free college movement, because they see a lot of community colleges becoming feeder systems to the four-year liberal arts institutions, and they're essentially ceding ground to career colleges, which are primarily in our sector. There's a large portion of them in our sector. And there isn't a great focus on that or discussion, even though people have called on alternatives, including current leadership in this administration, to the traditional four-year degree or bachelor's degree or liberal arts education. So there's some actually in our sector that go, that's totally fine. We are going to own post-secondary career education.
Other thoughts on yes, Rich?
Well, it's in New York State where this idea has been further in practice than anywhere else, and the record there is mixed on the impact it has on other institutions. Some have lost a lot of students to the free college takers, and others have not. We commissioned a study that by Bill Zumeta at the University of Washington that simulated what might happen if the portable tuition grant that most states now have were increased by $1,000. What would happen to the flows of students given the income structure in the state and the price of tuition? And it turned out that in many of those states, more students would opt for the nonprofit colleges, and the state would save money because they'd have fewer people going to the public institution. We encouraged our state associations to wield this report in discussions in their states about the free college movement, and they did mostly without much impact, which was surprising.
Yeah,
Robert, do you want to have anything?
Yeah, I would just say that if there's debt-free public college without an increase to the Pell Grant or something else, that probably does put more private nonprofit colleges at risk. And I think that's why the closure conversation becomes more important. And I think you may even see, if there's debt-free college that's reasonably funded for public institutions, some of the publics may try to acquire the campuses of these struggling nonprofits.
And yes, I think we had another question over here.
Sorry to monopolize. From the National Governors Association. We've been talking about kind of issues with financial and some of the, like Argosy was regionally accredited, and so we had a little bit more flexibility from a state perspective there. But the reality is many of the closures that have happened over the last decade have been with issues, institutions with issues of quality or with issues of questionable outcomes, maybe high student loan default rates and issues of quality within their licensure passage rates. And then states or institutions are a lot more limited as to what they can do for teach out. So a lot of our community colleges didn't want to step up when ITT was closing because it would endanger their own programs, having what were lower quality outcomes come into their schools. So could you talk a little bit, and I know there's no state regulators here, so, but you could talk a little bit about kind of that element of closure and when quality is the issue and finances fall after that and in issues that have come out of the Department of Education.
So let me take a stab at the first bit. I think one, and this doesn't quite get to the closures, but it does get to why it is you need to have better standards at the outset, particularly on quality. So, some things like gainful employment, I see as really important to getting there and making sure that students are actually getting quality education that lead to jobs that provide gainful employment. Now, what that does to the closure conversation is something different, because I think it could, quite frankly, exacerbate the closure problem. But I do think you hit on an excellent point, which is that particularly with institutions that have outcome metrics focused, outcome-based metrics, licensing exam passage rates, for example, that their accreditors are keeping an eye on, it is hard to accept those students because you don't want them. You want to help the students, you want to be there for them, but at the same time, you as the school don't want to sort of pay a price for that. And I think there may need to be wiggle room, whether or not accreditors can sort of turn a blind eye to that, to help schools who want to reach out to students to help students in the case of a closure can do that. I know that's something we thought about at the department in one set of circumstances, and quite frankly, the accreditor I don't think was able to sort of get there with enough speed because of sort of a lack of advanced planning. But I think those are sort of excellent questions that others might have some thoughts on.
Well, I would say, Sir Barbara's going to speak to it, accreditation is usually when we talk about quality in the triad. But I think there is a movement, and every day it continues to pick up. We're headed there, and that is a focus on outcomes and more data. There are bills right now in Congress, bipartisan bills, that call for more data transparency, the sharing of information between different agencies in the federal government to make sure that we can focus on student outcomes and post-graduation success. We are all about that, transparency, openness, having all of the data available and allowing consumers to judge those institutions, and then allow the states to figure out how to regulate around that. I think it's inevitable that we're going to get there. The data train has already left the station. It's just a matter of time when we start to get more and more better data and information to make decisions around.
Barbara, did you have anything on this?
Yeah, we had one school a couple years ago that lost the approval for its nursing program by the state, and they refunded several millions of dollars to students who had been in the nursing program and worked to place them elsewhere. But through the recognition processes, maybe this is something to keep in mind to make sure, as you sort of forecast, Diane, earlier, that accreditors don't get dinged when they go through the recognition process if they're helpful to students.
That's in our neg reg too.
Excellent. It's in the neg reg, she
That's
said.
one of the
Yes.
provisions in neg reg, yep, that's right. Looks like we are out of time, so thank you all for listening to us, and here.
Very, very briefly, thank you all for coming out today and for a very informative discussion. I learned a lot. I'm particularly fascinated by the FDIC model a little bit, and I want to talk to Robert and Michael about their differences on that approach, but it's very interesting. Thank you, Secretary Jones, for being here. We look forward to the regulations once they come out again, and to our panelists. We really are very thankful, Michael and Rick, for your moderating and taking time out of your busy schedules, all of you and all your panelists, to be here. I just want to give a call out to our BPC staff, Shai and Kenny back here, and Dora Engel and Carolyn Cooper over there for helping arrange all this today. And finally, but not least, a special thanks to Paul and Strata Education Network for graciously supporting our work here at BPC. Thank you very much, and have a good day.